While we're still on the subject of Margaret Fuller and her false claim to Mathew Franklin Whittier's star-signed work, also to the F-signed work in the dial, but we're not going to get into that, I'm going to present some more evidence, and some of this evidence is going to be along the lines of proof, meaning the kind of proof that's proof to anyone. But some of it is going to be things that I've determined the hard way that it would just take too long to try to provide the evidence for here. So when I say I have determined, that means I put a whole bunch of work into verifying that something is true, but it's pretty deep and it would take a long time to present all the evidence. So I'm just going to state that, for the record, as they say, without trying to prove those things. So first off, I'm not quite sure how to get into this, but first off, Mathew was writing to the Boston Chronotype as XFW, basically a very thinly disguised signature because his initials were MFW. So he was signing these letters to the editor of the Boston Chronotype as XFW. And those ran from July 29, 1847 until June 24, 1848, so almost a year. And this began about a year after Mathew finished up his stint with the New York Tribune, writing as the star. He finished that in mid-46. This is mid-47. Now, Mathew continued to live in New York City during the summers for 2 or 3 years. He would go down to New Orleans, where he was undercover as an anti-slavery agent, apparently connecting with sympathizers and operatives of the Underground Railroad down there in the South. But for his cover, he was a reporter for the New Orleans Daily Delta. He signed as F there, just like he did in the Dial back in 1840-41. I'm not going to get into those, but just to establish that Mathew wrote these letters, they were, now I meant to write down how many there were. It was a vast number of these things. I'll put it up on the screen. I mean, he wrote sometimes every day, for a year. And they were mostly just chatty letters about New York City. If he included anything about the anti-slavery movement or his radical work, it must have been in code because you can't see very much of that. It's just the theater and what's going on, what's the latest information, just chatty letters. But Elijah Wright was a longtime friend, and they were both radicals and members of the American Anti-Slavery Association, Society, whichever it was. And so they were keeping in touch. But then, beginning in March 31 of 1849, so this is a little less than a year later, begins a column called Gossip from Gotham. Gotham, of course, is New York City. And these were unsigned, and I'm saying that those were Mathew. There's one possible contraindication, as I recall, where it looks as though the writer of the Gossip from Gotham column is going out on an extended trip that takes him, if I remember correctly, through Philadelphia or something like that. And that's the last we hear from him. Well, I don't think so. I think that was Mathew making a very, very quick run to Philadelphia and back, because as another signature, he appears 2 days later, see? So, of course, the trains were running at that time. So I think he took a very quick trip out to that city and came back and pretended that he was going off to points west. That's to hide himself. And it's difficult to follow Mathew when he's doing this anti-slavery work because he did purposefully obfuscate his trail. So anyway, also in the Boston Chronotype, Mathew signed as the star. There's 11 instances, and they begin from October of 1846, which is, say, only a few months after he stopped writing as the star for the Tribune. They go to July 15, 1848. For 2 years, there's star-signed articles. And then the Chronotype, Elijah Wright was booted out of the Chronotype in 1850, if I recall. So this gives you some idea of how he's working. Now, what I want to deal with specifically is 2 star-signed reviews in the New York Tribune in 1846, which have to do with capital punishment. Somebody had published a pro-capital punishment book, and Mathew had to review it. Apparently, it was assigned to him. Now, whether Horace Greeley, the editor-in-chief, assigned it to Margaret Fuller, and Margaret Fuller gave it to Mathew to finish, We don't know. I don't know how that worked exactly, whether Mathew was dealing directly with Greeley or was dealing through Margaret Fuller. Horace Greeley may not even have known about Mathew's existence. He may not have known that Mathew was ghostwriting for Margaret Fuller. That's kind of the way the history looks. So anyway, Mathew reviewed this book. He reviewed it once, and then there was attacks on him. And apparently the people making these attacks believed the rumor that Margaret Fuller was writing as the star. That's where it really got started. And so Mathew, as the star, responds in such a way that he says in code that it's not Margaret Fuller, but he doesn't come right out and say it. He fudges it. He writes it in such a way that it could be Margaret Fuller, but if you look closely, it isn't, and we'll get into that in a minute. I want to talk about that. There is precedent for Mathew being against capital punishment. There's at least 4 instances that I know of, if you count his anti-lynching satire in the Boston Chronotype. He was signing as B, which stood for Bertram, which was the character in Lady Geraldine's Courtship, which he wrote. But anyway, Margaret Fuller died in a seafaring tragedy right off Fire Island on her way back from Europe, because she'd been the European correspondent for the paper, continuing to sign as the star, as though that was really her pseudonym. But she died on July 19, 1850. So what I want to do is to look at one of the pieces which indicate that Mathew was in fact against capital punishment, just to set the stage for this. So we know that he plausibly was in fact the author of this review and the rebuttal in the New York Tribune. So this is later, actually. This is May 19, 1849. It's in the Boston Chronotype. It's unsigned. This is one of the letters titled Gossip from Gotham, which again is not signed. The letter itself is dated May 8th, 1849, and I'm going to go ahead and read a good bit of it because this is Mathew Franklin Whittier, and if it is indeed him, this tells you what he was doing in New York City. It also tells us why he could not come out and defend Edgar Allan Poe's Theft of the Raven. I've stated that many times, that he was doing dangerous anti-slavery undercover work, and that's why he couldn't come out and dispute Poe's claim to the Raven. But I think it goes in one ear and out the other because nobody believes me. Well, nobody believes me about anything. But here, if this is Mathew, you can see what he was involved in, see? So I'm going to read maybe all of it. I don't know. You can fast forward if you want. Dear Chronotype, the anniversaries now are in full blast. Great is the company of preachers, general agents, and philanthropists. Eloquence is dog cheap, and zealous humanity a drug. The clouds give a perpetual drizzle. Umbrellas are in demand. Quote, Day and Martin is a superfluity. I don't know what Day and Martin means. Still, the streets are crowded with good men in black, and every meeting is thronged with spectators. Last evening, Monday, the New York Society for the Abolition of Capital Punishment held its annual meeting in the Minerva Rooms. The large hall was filled to a perfect jam. Many were obliged to go away without obtaining admission. Extra seats were constantly brought in till there was no room for more, and every square foot of the hall was occupied. Wendell Phillips made one of his most brilliant efforts in a speech which called forth a tumult of applause. His fine, commanding figure and impressive countenance, his polished, classical language, the richness of his historical illustrations, and the temperate, subdued enthusiasm with which he treated the subject told with great effect on his intelligent auditory, and must have disposed the most prejudiced mind to the reception of his humane, beneficent doctrines. He dwelt at some length on the efforts which had been made in Massachusetts in behalf of Washington Good, the change in public opinion which they indicated, and the prospect that the execution of that unhappy Negro, if consummated, would be the last to disgrace the legislation of Massachusetts. The principal argument in favor of capital punishment, he said, was the theological one. Orthodox divines were afraid that their doctrinal system would be weakened if the gallows were set aside. For himself, he held to the orthodox doctrines, but he rejoiced to argue the question on the ground of the Bible. He would shut himself up with the covers of the Old Testament and there demonstrate that all the attributes of the deity were hostile to this desecration of humanity. Nor did he like to restrict the sphere of Christianity. Wherever he saw a noble impulse of the human heart, a generous act for the benefit of society, a character like that of Wilberforce, Garrison, and Fry, he saw the spirit of his master and welcomed its appearance in the veil of flesh, V-A-I-L. This spirit would destroy the gallows with all its bloody appurtenances and cause the waters of tenderness and love to melt the hardest rock of obstinacy and sin in the heart of the criminal. Now, here comes Horace Greeley, and that, of course, is his editor on the New York Tribune, or former editor at this point. Horace Greeley succeeded Mr. Phillips in a short but pithy and most effective speech. The appearance of his celebrated white coat about the middle of the evening, while Phillips was in the full flow of his rich eloquence, was the signal for a universal cheer on the part of the audience. Mr. Greeley cannot show his face in a popular meeting of this kind without calling forth a hearty burst of applause, whether he opens his mouth or not. He humorously applied the reductio ad absurdum to the defense of an American gallows union, and showed, without a flaw in his transparent logic, that if capital punishment were indeed the divine blessing which its advocates claim for it, the wisest and virtuousest of the land ought to combine in an organization for its support and promotion. He was succeeded by William Elder of Philadelphia, who, in one of his characteristic fire-breathing, daredevil specimens of Western oratory, produced a most powerful impression. He related several startling anecdotes within his own experience, illustrating the horrors of capital punishment, which could scarcely be heard with a dry eye. The American Anti-Slavery Society have just adjourned their morning session in the Tabernacle, which, in spite of the abominable weather, was filled to overflowing. The tone of the meeting was the mildest I ever attended. That means he was there. Mathew was there, though it showed no signs of discouragement. The speakers, besides Mr. Garrison, who presided and opened the meeting with some pertinent introductory remarks, were Parker Pillsbury, Wendell Phillips, and Frederick Douglass. Pillsbury was forcible, witty, and caustic as usual, though free from the sledgehammer denunciations which he often wields with more violence than effect. Phillips was no less enchanting than on the previous evening, and moved and delighted everybody. Douglas's speech was principally a repetition of his remarks on, quote, the great men of this country, of which I gave you a notice in a former letter. And he says a little bit more about a rowdy scene at a theater here. So from this we know that as of May 19, 1849, Mathew Franklin Whittier saw, among other greats in these liberal movements, William Lloyd Garrison. And it is in 1849, in the fall of 1849, that I have determined, here again, what I have determined, that Mathew began working as a liaison directly for William Lloyd Garrison, writing his travelogue, signing Quails in the Boston Weekly Museum, which was falsely claimed by entertainer Ashen Dodge, and then historians picked that up and believed it, and attribute that Quails travelogue in the Boston Weekly Museum to Ashen Dodge. It was never Ashen Dodge. It was Mathew acting as a secret liaison and reporting through that travelogue. So when he goes to Europe and he is personally invited to sit with Victor Hugo in Victor Hugo's living room, that's not slapstick entertainer Ashen Dodge. That's Mathew, because, as I've said before in these entries, Ashen Dodge would never have gotten a personal invitation to visit with Victor Hugo, who was, a radical. And even Mathew Franklin Whittier might not have gotten an invitation, even being the brother of John Greenleaf Whittier. But the personal liaison to William Lloyd Garrison would have. So that is Mathew writing as Gossip from Gotham in May of 1849. We see what he was into. We see that he was definitely against capital punishment. Now, before I get into the actual examples, I want to show you Margaret Fuller's Memoirs. Here they are in 2 volumes, original. And these were not written by Margaret Fuller. They were written after her death in 1850. in, what did we say, July 19, 1850. And two of the principal people, I don't know if there were others, there may have been others, but two of the principal people were Horace Greeley, who was her editor, and Ralph Waldo Emerson, who also worked with her on the Dial to the extent that she was the editor and he promised to at least contribute one piece per edition. But he knew her as a member of the Transcendentalists. So I'm going to read a little bit from each. And the first I'm going to look at is Horace Greeley. And what he tells us, I'll read it, but the gist of what he tells us, he's trying very hard to be nice. He really didn't like her, at least at first anyway, because apparently Horace Greeley's wife was a big fan of Margaret Fuller, an enthusiastic fan, and invited her to come up to New York and live with them in their house. See, and Horace Greeley didn't dare, buck his wife because she was so fanatical in her enthusiastic fanship of Margaret Fuller. You've seen marriages like that and relationships like that. If one person is totally into something, the other person doesn't dare rock the boat to the extent of crossing him or her on that. So, or they do at their peril. So Horace Greeley, apparently, discretion was the better part of valor, and he did not cross his wife on this extreme admiration for Margaret Fuller, and they invited her to live with the Greeleys, which she did. But Horace Greeley apparently thought that she was, first off, she was kind of an upper class snob, and the Greeleys were middle class, so she was roughing it, to live there with them. But he thought that she was kind of neurotic and kind of lazy, which is to say a lot of times she didn't feel good, and Horace Greeley was accustomed to just knocking stuff out for the paper, and she could only get herself motivated to write when she really liked the subject and really felt motivated to write, and when she felt well and wasn't feeling ill and so on. See, so she wasn't real helpful as a literary editor. So what actually happened was that either Fuller hired Mathew as a ghostwriter, which he'd been doing that for the Dial before, or else Greeley hired Mathew as a freelancer. I don't know which it was. But here he's going to tell us basically that Margaret Fuller didn't write unless she darn well felt like it. Her earlier contributions to the Tribune were not her best, which Mathew's were excellent. And as a matter of fact, Horace Greeley gave Mathew the top editorial position early on when it came to the holidays. I can't remember which one, like New Year's or Christmas or 4th of July. Mathew wrote those, signing as a star, and they were excellent. And if they weren't excellent, Greeley never would have stepped aside, and put them in his editorial column or right at the front of the front page, wherever they are. So this is not really true unless there's some other pieces that she wrote that didn't actually get in the paper. See, that makes you think that maybe Horace Greeley did know that Mathew was freelancing for the paper. It's not clear. Anyway, her earlier contributions to the Tribune were not her best, and I did not at first prize her aid so highly as I afterwards learned to do. She wrote always freshly, vigorously, but not always clearly. But these are all extremely clear, these star sign pieces, like all of Mathew's work is. For her full and intimate acquaintance with continental literature, especially German, seemed to have marred her felicity and readiness of expression in her mother tongue, which is nonsense. I've never heard of anybody who's like a good writer in English who then learns German and it ruins their ability to write in English. So I think he's lying, frankly. It just doesn't make any logical sense. That doesn't happen. So then he says, while I never met another woman who conversed more freely or lucidly, the attempt to commit her thoughts to paper seemed to induce a singular embarrassment and hesitation. She could write only when in the vein, and this needed often to be waited for through several days, while the occasion sometimes required an immediate utterance. The new book must be reviewed before other journals had thoroughly dissected and discussed it, else the ablest critic would command no general attention, and perhaps be by the greater number unread. So he goes on like that, and he says, either here or elsewhere, that his output was 10 times hers. But I think I counted 238 from fall of 1844 until mid-1846, 238 there's like 2 or 3 per week or 4 per week, you know. Each weekly edition has maybe 3 in it. Well, if Margaret Fuller was the way he describes, it's impossible. You know, either he's describing her in a very negative, unfair way, or else she couldn't possibly have written those 238 star sign pieces. We know she didn't write the one where the writer says that his or her birthday was in the middle of winter, because her birthday was not in the middle of winter. I've been over that before. Neither is Matthew's. Horace Greeley's is, but the truth is it's much more likely Matthew wrote that and lied about his birthday, which he would occasionally do so nobody could figure out who it was, than that Horace Greeley, the editor, who was hugely busy, would take the time out to write a book review of a children's book. See, it's not logical. So we know that wasn't Margaret Fuller. It's very unlikely that Margaret Fuller was invited to tour the engine room of a large steamship, but the star-signed writer did go down and tour the, quote, heart and lungs of a huge steamship by invitation. See, so that wasn't Margaret Fuller. It wasn't Margaret Fuller who negotiated with an elderly black lady to do her laundry, because Margaret Fuller lived with the Greeleys, and Mrs. Greeley either did it herself or made arrangements for a girl to come in and do it or something like that. Margaret Fuller would not have been making arrangements for her laundry. So, but Matthew lived in a boarding house, so that would have been Matthew. So there are little indicators if you scrutinize these things. But just the fact that Horace Greeley says she was lazy and temperamental, and elsewhere I think it's, you know, she was often ill-disposed, you know, so she was neurotic, and she could not have written all this material. It's impossible. And then we have what I talked about in the previous couple entries, you know, about Matthew's signing with the Star all his life, that he had a series in the Philadelphia Album in 1831 of 18 star-signed reviews and essays, one review, and the rest of them were editorials that sound exactly the same as the ones in the Tribune. So right there we have it, basically. So it's like, it's not necessary for me to keep digging for more evidence. This evidence is plenty, you know. The skeptic in my documentary said, I want to see 8x10 glossies. You know, well, these are the equivalent of 8x10 glossies. Already we know that Margaret Fuller didn't write those. And the significance of this, I don't mean to go on so much, but the significance of this is, if I can absolutely prove that one of these 4 major authors that I claim was really stealing Matthew's work, if I can substantiate that one of these claims was correct, that Mathew Franklin Whittier actually did write the material that made Margaret Fuller famous, most of it, then the others are not so implausible. You see what I'm saying? If I knock down one of these 4 pins, I've got Margaret Fuller and Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Edgar Allan Poe and Charles Dickens, and that all sounds ridiculous. If I knock down one of those 4 pillars, the other 3 go like dominoes, see? Suddenly it's plausible, you know? Mathew Franklin Whittier's work made Margaret Fuller famous. Well, if that's true, and I basically proved that she couldn't have written this stuff, you know, if that's true, then the others could also be true. Suddenly I'm not crazy anymore. You see what I'm saying? Okay, so let's look at what the other writer said. And this was Ralph Waldo Emerson. And the reason this is significant is because Matthew refers to it in code. Now, Matthew's so deeply hidden in the history that one thing depends on another. This is the Boston Weekly Museum of 1852. The Boston Museum ran from mid-1848 to mid-1852. In 1852, it was bought out by that same entertainer who claimed Matthew's Quayle's travelogue, Ashendage. He was so wealthy from being basically a rock star that he bought the paper. And when he bought the paper, Quayle's disappears. He's gone. But Matthew did one last satirical series. And this was a woman named Sally Sage, a character. Sally Sage was like a radical feminist who imagined that she was a great philosopher. She was a great fan of Margaret Fuller. She was one of the people at the time who sort of channeled Margaret Fuller, or imagined that they were channeling Margaret Fuller from the higher spheres. It was all a bunch of crap. And what apparently had happened is that a woman like this had taken Mathew for a ride. And he was not married at this time. But she apparently, I won't say seduced him, but anyway, he got entangled with this woman because he imagined she was the real thing, like his first wife Abby had been. Abby was the real deal, a brilliant, mystical young woman. See, well, this was a phony. And she took him for a ride, and the 3 installments are about that. But the third one has to do with her worship of Margaret Fuller. So let me bring down my light. All I want to do, I don't want to get into the body of the thing. I just want to show you the opening quote, because this is the way that Mathew does his code. I've demonstrated it many times. And I've gone over this a little bit, but I want to show you the whole deal here. He's quoting Margaret Fuller. I know all the people worth knowing in America, and I find no intellect comparable to my own. Now, this is Ralph Waldo Emerson quoting her directly. So I think it's direct quote. And then there's a bunch of asterisks, which indicates that there's a certain amount of text that's been omitted. And then he finishes with, he appreciates me. Okay, now we don't know who that is. Who's being referred to here, and why did he tack that on? Well, if you look at it, what you find is he skipped over about 1.5 pages to get to that last little bit. And what's in the middle? See, this is what Mathew does. The real message you're supposed to get is not in the direct quote. It's next to the quote, or it's in between, in the part that's been omitted. See, that's his little technique. So I'm going to read what Ralph Waldo Emerson said. It's under a title called Self-Esteem, which might as well be egotism, but in the Memoirs, it's nicer to say self-esteem. Margaret at first astonished and repelled us, that's the royal we, by a complacency that seemed the most assured since the days of Scaliger. I don't know who Scaliger is. She spoke in the quietest manner of the girls she had formed, the young men who owed everything to her, the fine companions she had long ago exhausted. In the coolest way, she said to her friends, I now know, quote, all the people worth knowing in America, and I find no, quote, intellect comparable to my own. Okay, that's in the quote, but now let's continue. In vain, on one occasion, I professed my reverence for a youth of genius and my curiosity in his future. Dash, quote, oh no, she was intimate, quote, with his mind, and I, quote, spoiled him by overrating him. Meantime, we knew that she neither had seen nor would see his subtle superiorities. That's on page 234. Okay, then we go 235, 236, and at the top of page 236, we see, it is certain that Margaret occasionally let slip, with all the innocence imaginable, some phrase betraying the presence of a rather mountainous me, and in a way to surprise those who knew her good sense, she could say, as if she were stating a scientific fact, in enumerating the merits of somebody, quote, he appreciates me. Mathew skips like 1.5 pages to get to that last little bit and include it in his quote. Now, what was he driving at? A friend of mine, when I shared that with him, said, well, do you think that Ralph Waldo Emerson was referring to Mathew? And I demurred, I thought, well, that's really, too much for me to claim. And I said, no, I think he just was referring to somebody like him or some kind of identifying. I don't think so. I think he was referring to Mathew Franklin Whittier, and that's why Mathew skipped 1.5 pages to get to that last little part. That's why, he leaves the meat of the thing in the middle with where those asterisks are. It has to have been him. And that, I didn't know that Mathew had written the star sign reviews in the Tribune when I was talking to my friend about it. Had I known that, I would have realized, no, we got too much evidence that Ralph Waldo Emerson knew Mathew, and that he knew how good a philosopher Mathew really was, and he knew that Margaret Fuller was basically a phony in that department. So that's that. Now I wanted to show you something else. There was a direct disciple of my guru, Avatar Meher Baba, named Darwin Shaw. Darwin Shaw was an important figure in the Meher Baba legacy. among the Western followers. And his daughter, Leatrice, I don't have it in front of me. I looked for it online. There's nothing online, but I know I have read that his daughter, Leatrice Shaw, said that he was the reincarnation of Ralph Waldo Emerson. And I have to reduce my light here and put it up a bit. And I think he was. I didn't know him well. I knew him from seeing him when I would visit the Maher Spiritual Center occasionally. And I'm going to put here on the screen, my apologies to anybody else in the picture. If they want me to blur them out, I'll be happy to do it. But I don't think anybody's ashamed of having been at the Maher Spiritual Center. This was quite some years ago. You see me in the lower left-hand corner expostulating, I think expostulating is the right way to say that word, holding forth in front of Darwin Shaw and to his wife, Jean Shaw. See, and look at the expression on Darwin's face. You know, he's amused. He's kindly amused at me holding forth. See, if I had any brains, I would have kept my mouth shut and let Darwin Shaw talk. But I was young and stupid, and instead I'm holding forth here, showing off, see? And, you know, Darwin kind of looking at the younger generation is mildly amused at me, I think, is what's going on there. It's a great photograph. I don't know who took it even, you know, it was just a snapshot. I probably knew Darwin Shaw about as well as Mathew knew Ralph Waldo Emerson, which is to say, not personally, not really well, but enough to meet with him and, you know, in a group maybe or something like that. So I wanted to show you that. Now, let's take a look at these particular reviews, because there's some more code in here, first of all. And this is when the rumor that Margaret Fuller was the author became crystallized. Here we have, this came out of a bound volume, and since they were consecutive, the people selling them to me didn't unbind them. But this is the weekly edition. The daily editions show up, let's see, in the March 3rd, 1846 and March 10, 1846 editions, respectively. Here we have the first one in the March 7, 1846 edition. I'm going to get my light going again. I might as well have just left it. Okay, sorry about the light, but basically I have to be able to see this little tiny type. So this is the second item on the front page. It's called Darkness Visible, A Defense of Capital Punishment by Reverend George B. Cheever, D.D., and an essay on the ground and reason of punishment with special reference to the penalty of death by Taylor Lewis, Esquire, etc. And so here he writes, let me get a quick sip of water without spilling it on anything. We have had this book before us for several weeks, but the task of reading it has been so repulsive that we have been obliged to get through it by short stages with long intervals of rest and refreshment between, and have only just reached the end. Now, this is the opposite, basically, of Margaret Fuller's reluctance to write, as Horace Greeley indicates. He's so disgusted by this thing that he has to take it in small doses and then you know, refresh himself in between mentally. Says, we believe, however, we are now possessed of its substance, so far as it is possible to admit into any mind matter wholly uncongenial with its structure, its faith, and its hope. Meanwhile, others have shown themselves more energetic in the task, so there have been reviews in the meantime, and notices have appeared that express, in part, our own views. Among others, an able critic has thus summed up his impressions, quote, of this whole we will say briefly that its premises are monstrous, its reasoning sophistical, its conclusions absurd, and its spirit diabolic. So that's Matthew's quote of another critic. So then he goes into each one of those statements in detail. So that's all we need to look at for that one. We just know that he absolutely lambasted this book on capital punishment, and deservedly so, in my opinion. I hold the same views that Mathew held. I haven't changed. As I've said, my higher mind is the same. That means my values are the same. The way I think is the same. Now here we get to the March 14, 1846 weekly. This is the weekly. I don't have to hold it up. It looks the same as the other one. And here we have darkness visible. Let me read this at some length, but I'm going to get to something in particular. We see with pleasure that an article under this head in our issue of March 7th is to become the means of instruction to the public through the columns of the Courier and Inquirer as to the precise meaning attached by the writers who were the subject of that article to their favorite stigma of, quote, infidelity. The public will, in future, know exactly what they mean by the use of the term, and if excited to horror and aversion toward those to whom it is applied, it will not be in ignorance or mistake. In other words, somebody must have called him an infidel, see? So now he's sarcastically saying, well, now they'll know what an infidel is. That's the way I take it. A series of articles is to be published which may easily be read, as in length they will generally, quote, not exceed a column. There is promise of clear and straightforward statements, such as may be met in a, quote, chivalrous spirit. This is all that can be desired. Suitable opponents are challenged and indeed are no longer to be permitted, quote, to skulk behind a female who, however personal and abusive she might be, could not, especially on such questions as these, be treated as a proper and legitimate adversary. So this is very condescending, assuming that the author of the previous review was Margaret Fuller, and they're mistaken, see? But this is, the rumor has been out now, and they are now, this is where the idea that Margaret Fuller wrote as the Star originated, with the pro-capital punishment people who were disparaging that author, see? It's basically like in the military when the sergeant says, all right, ladies, you know, it's basically that tone. We were not aware, this is Mathew speaking with the royal we were not aware that the Bible or the welfare of human beings were subjects improper for the consideration of, quote, females, whether, quote, fair or otherwise. So he's taking up the challenge as regards women. He's defending women. As a man, as a liberal man, he's now defending women. This is not Margaret Fuller defending herself. We had also supposed that, in the field of literature, the meeting was not between man and woman, but between mind and mind. Now, I've already demonstrated that Mathew was a feminist, essentially, that he was pro-women, as of 1831. So again, this is a liberal man defending the attack on women. I'll read that again. We had also supposed that, in the field of literature, the meeting was not between man and woman, but between mind and mind. Personal allusions to private life should indeed be excluded from this field, whether man meets man or man meets woman. On occasions where the theme is purely intellectual, we had supposed that, in all civilized communities, the question was, is the mode of treating the subject noble, the statement commanding, the thought just, or the reverse? And that in either case, it mattered not whether the mind from which such statement originated was placed here on earth as man or as woman. Even among the Hebrews, the only sufficient authority, we believe, with T.L., one of the authors, we find numerous instances in which all such considerations were set aside as not to the purpose on such an occasion. Though, however, we are now informed that there are minds so penetrated with the spirit of chivalry that they cannot regard a woman as an adversary, this is Mathew's sarcasm, we should not advise the band of, quote, heroic philanthropists censured in the Courier and Inquirer for seeking to protect themselves behind the veil and parasol of this mistaken Clorinda, to regard them as secure panoply, the impossibility of assailing a female writer being expressed in the following passage. So what he's saying is that he sarcastically calls these people chivalrous and say that they're hiding behind the spirit of chivalry, basically, by saying that they cannot take a woman as an adversary. But note this phrase, this mistaken Clorinda. Well, now, I forget now what I determined for my book, as I looked it up. But a Clorinda basically means an Amazon, a woman warrior. There's some figure, Clorinda, in a ancient poem, if I remember correctly, who is like an Amazon. So when he says this mistaken Clorinda, that can be taken either of two ways. It means that the Clorinda who actually wrote the piece was charged with being mistaken. That's the obvious meaning. Or it can mean that it's a mistake to say it was a Clorinda. That's the real meaning behind this. Now, I wouldn't say that if I didn't have all these other examples of Matthew speaking in code under circumstances where he doesn't want to reveal his hand, see? That's the closest Matthew can come. After having defended women, it's the closest he can come to saying, this wasn't a woman. I'm not a woman. It's a mistake to think that it's a Clorinda, see? So I know from having seen Matthew 10, 15, 20 times use code like this, where I'm absolutely certain of it. It's not guesswork. This is kind of guesswork in a sense. Again, this is something I've determined that's very difficult to prove outright, except with all the other evidence. We know Margaret Fuller can't be the author of this series. First off, Matthew's had this pseudonym for years and used it for material that sound exactly the same as this. And secondly, Margaret Fuller, by Horace Greeley's own description, couldn't possibly have written all this material. And then there's other indicators, like Margaret Fuller supposedly touring the engine room of a ship and arranging for her own laundry and saying that she was born in the winter. And, there's too many pieces of evidence. But in this particular instance, he is saying the idea of this having been written by a Clorinda is a mistake, because it wasn't, after having defended women against the attack, see? So that's all. That's just what I wanted to show. And I'm afraid that it was rather scattershot. I don't feel like I was very organized, but I think you get the idea. I did find out that I actually did read that entire story, The New Year's Bells, before, back in July. So when I get on here and explain from top to bottom without notes exactly how Charles Dickens came to be associated with A Christmas Carol, I'll put the link to that underneath. I don't know that I'll necessarily read the whole story again, but I'll put the link to that. And there's a Christmas story that Abby wrote that Matthew published for her in the not the last, but one of the last editions of the Boston Carpetbags, unsigned. And I think I might read that one instead. It's got some nice little illustrations and just shows you that Abby was writing Christmas stories, on her own. There's one thing I forgot to mention, and rather than set everything up again, I'm just going to do this from behind the graphics. Regarding this the last few editions of the Boston Weekly Museum, it's in the May 22nd edition, 1852, that we see this third number of the series concerning Sally Sage. And it so happens that I think that situation was well over with by this time. And Matthew knew that this paper was wrapping up, and he knew he would not have any part in Ocean Dodge's resurrection of the paper when he bought it out. So what Matthew liked to do was to dedicate his work to Abby, to her memory. So in the previous edition, I see something called The Poet's Courtship by Coleridge. And this is a poem that Matthew had kind of inaugurated the Boston Carpetbag with when he started working on that paper and was partly a financial investor in that paper. He put that in the very first edition of the Boston Carpetbag, along with other things. Actually, the whole front page is Matthew's, not Benjamin Shillaber's. So here he has finished up the Boston Weekly Museum with this poem. And I know that Matthew particularly liked this poem and that it resonated with him as a description of his courtship with Abby, because his second love poem to Abby in 1832 in the New York Constellation, when he was editing that paper, was based on this poem, kind of a tribute, I would say. And actually, I think Matthew's is better, or at least as good as Coleridge is. But anyway, that was a tribute to Abby, I think, deliberately inserted in the paper by Matthew. And then we have this Sally Sage, the third number of Sally Sage, which I've already gone into. In the next to last edition of May 29, on the, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6th page of this 8-page paper, most of that page is taken up with Lady Geraldine's Courtship. And of course, it's attributed to Elizabeth B. Browning, but that was actually Mathew's poem. And more importantly, it was Mathew's poem about his courtship with Abby and how she would tutor him. It was about their tutoring and how brilliant she was. See, so what he's done is he's contrasted Margaret Fuller with the real female genius, which was Abby Poyen. So that's all I wanted to share, just that little bit, and we'll go ahead and get this thing edited.